Ok, donc on est en train de commencer et je voudrais seulement vous donner le bienvenu ici.
All right, so we are starting now. I would like to welcome you here in this discussion, where we will discuss working conditions in many European countries. We have here representatives from Portugal, from Italy, and from France, whom I will present after a brief introduction. I would encourage you to ask questions after the introductions by the speakers. And let me remind you that you can find interpretation in English, in Spanish, and in Italian. If you want Italian interpretation, you need to click on Chinese. So you need to choose Chinese interpretation in order to listen to the Italian interpretation. Let me also remind you that this cycle of roundtables and educationals of the Fourth International will continue. In fact, the next one after this discussion will be a second roundtable for today, which will happen at 5:30. It will be called Fight Against Capitalist Normativity. The speakers will be Luis Rangel from Mexico, Laia Facet from Spanish State, and Leonard Brice from France. Now, for the current roundtable, I would like to speak a bit about the conditions of the working class in times of COVID-19. During the COVID-19 crisis, we saw measures that were taken by capitalists in order to let the production continue. Although the epidemic had expanded a lot, the epidemic spread in particular in the workplaces, in production places, but also in the places of social reproduction, where women workers, such as nurses in particular, worked during the whole crisis in order to ensure the good health of people, for instance, people in hospitals because of the COVID. The COVID-19 crisis interrupted social movements that had started before the crisis. It is the case, for instance, of the movement against the pension reform, for which Sophie Cadeau, an activist from the NPA in France, will speak. Regarding the importance of social movements, Carolina Almeida from Portugal will speak. She is here as the spokesperson of a collective in Portugal called Precarios Inflexibles. We will discuss the importance of organizing oneself in social movements. In particular, this is very important in times of such a crisis, which is being paid by the workers of production and reproduction sectors. And then we'll have Eliana from Sinistra Anticapitalista in Italy, who will discuss what happened in Italy during the crisis. Each speaker will get to give an introduction, but then we'll have questions. We will start with Eliana, then with Sophie, and then in the end we'll discuss with Carolina. So Eliana, would you like to tell us a bit about the situation in Italy? Eliana, we cannot hear you.
Ok, vous m'écoutez? Voilà.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah.
Avant tout, merci pour votre invitation.
First of all, thanks a lot
Et pour
for
moi, c'est
inviting me.
un grand plaisir d'être parmi vous.
For me, it's a great pleasure to be with you, at least online.
Un moment, pardon, je dois, oui, je dois fermer la traduction. Un moment.
Oh, wait, I need to shut down my interpretation channel.
Ok, ok. Alors, j'espère
All right.
aujourd'hui surtout de vous faire part.
So I hope, well, today I hope I will be able to share with you how angry I am and how much I suffered, because this great tragedy could have been avoided. It was a tragedy in Europe, and now it's even a genocide. The responsibilities for this catastrophe are political.
Laissez-moi raconter ce qu'il est passé où je vis. Vous savez déjà qu'il y avait
So first, I will tell you what happened.
25 000 décès. L'Italie
As you know, there have been more than 25,000 deaths in Italy. It was one of the hardest hit countries in Europe, in particular the region of Lombardy, which is one of the most industrialized and one of the most polluted regions in Europe, was hit very hard. 14,000 people died in this region, more than half the total number of deaths in Italy. 6,000 people died in Bergamo alone, which is the city where I live, which was the most hit by the epidemic. The increase in mortality rate was 700% in this city. First of all, you need to know that the first epidemic of COVID-19 in the Lombardy exploded in a small city in February. A red zone was immediately created to isolate the virus. But only 3 days later, on 23rd of February, a second cluster appeared a few kilometers away in the very much industrialized valley north of Bergamo. This cluster was not isolated. No red zone was created there. The virus spread extremely quickly in the province of Bergamo and then in the whole of Lombardy. Within 2 weeks, between the end of February and the mid-March, there was a huge catastrophe. What led to no red zone being defined around Bergamo was the defense of economic interests. For capitalists, what was the most important was not the epidemic, but for the production to continue. So, in terms of measures taken, schools and public places were closed, and the government told us to stay at home. But on the other hand, we had to continue going to work as if nothing had happened. So much so that in just one day, 252 people died in Lombardy. Let me tell you a story. During the Second World War, when the biggest company of Bergamo was bombed, when the biggest factory of Bergamo was bombed, there were 278 workers who died during the Second World War because no one rang the alarm, because no one wanted to stop the production. Workers died under bombs. Now imagine the same thing with 2,000 bombs. In mid-March, you had a huge bombing in my region, basically, with 252 people dying. But then the idea was still the same. Let's not stop the production. And such bombings continued every day.
Aucun contrôle n'est effectué sur les personnes qui ont
No controls were implemented for workers.
Comprenez-vous? La plupart des gens
No tests were run for
sans aucun tampon de
people. People were let alone to die in their homes. And therefore, official figures are below the reality. Thousands died in their pension, in their pension homes.
De transfert les personnes soi-disant guéries dans les maisons de retraite.
Political officials decided to transfer people who were supposedly healed, to transfer them back to pension homes because there was no more space in hospitals, and these people were turned into time bombs in pension homes. In the hospitals, the situation was dramatic. In mid-March, there was no more space in intensive care units, and doctors had to choose who to heal. This was the result of years of budget cuts in public health by governments from the right wing, from the left wing, from the center. At the peak of the health crisis, we had no space in intensive care units for one simple reason. Intensive care does not lead to profit. Almost 200 health workers died because of COVID. Many people died in the hospital's corridors, and even in ambulances, which could not access to the hospitals anymore. If I could describe to you how many times I heard the noises of the ambulances in March, every 20 minutes I could hear an ambulance. I would also like to tell you that during those terrible weeks, even leaders of national trade unions did not understand that what we needed was an immediate lockdown and to demand to stop all unessential productions. Rather, trade unions continued to demand for masks and security control and safety control, safety measures in companies and so on. But the situation in Lombardy and in other regions of the north of the country, the only possible safety measure was to stop the production. In this situation, trade unions should not have negotiated. Gloves and masks were not enough. And we should bear in mind that even hospital staff had not enough masks, had not enough protective gear. In such a situation, how can you even demand for protective gear for company workers when you don't even have enough for doctors and nurses? In mid-March, finally, out of anger, there was a wave of strikes spreading across the country. In many companies, in many factories, the union representatives started to act under the pressure of rank-and-file workers. The movement was very spontaneous. Even though it was covered, it was then encouraged or supported by unions in some specific sectors, but the leaderships did not have enough courage to declare a general strike. We managed to get some factories to close in mid-March, but many factories remained open despite the wave of strikes. Many even had to work overtime hours. Workers continued to be sent to die in the factory. Only on the fourth sorry, the interpreter missed the date, but only 4 weeks after the beginning of the health crisis was the measure taken by the government to close down factories producing unessential goods. So that was on the 22nd of March, but that was too late. The day before that, on the 21st of March in Lombardy, you had 546 people dying in the region of Lombardy alone. 246 people died because of COVID. This was an earthquake, and factories only closed the day after that. I hope you can understand my anger. Now, after we paid for the health crisis, now they want us to pay for the economic crisis. Thousands of precarious workers have lost their job already and their wage, in particular in the sectors of tourism, culture, services, trade, sectors which were already precarious before the COVID. All those workers already have lost their job and their wage because of the health crisis, and they have not benefited from any financial help or any emergency measures. Money was given to the companies by the government, but nothing was given to precarious workers. Nowadays, thousands of additional workers may lose their or at risk of losing their job in the fall, in the next few months. So people had to continue to work when it was risky, when it was extremely dangerous to get out of home, and now they risk of being fired. I'm just telling you what happened. I hope that your generation, I hope that for most of the youth, this will mark a huge shift towards resistance, personal and political resistance. For many of you, this is the first time that we face something which is extremely unjust. We face a system which gives to the private market the responsibility of managing something which is as important as public health, and a system which bows down to industrialists and to their profits by risking our lives. I hope that I could make you understand how angry I am, and I hope that you understood how much we suffered. But please know that during this whole crisis, I never cried, except when my dearest friend died. But apart from this, I never cried. I do not want to forget about the responsibilities, about those who made this happen, about those who made an epidemic turn into a humanitarian disaster in my region and nowadays in Latin America, in one of the poorest regions of the world where there is a real genocide going on. Your generation, together with us, has to write the future history and has to write never again. We should never again have budget cuts in the public health. No more money for the private health sector. No more profits before life. No more precariousness and terrible wages. People need to know that without us, without the wage workers, without the workers, the country stops. And never again should we have such a high level of pollution, because it's not by mistake. It's not random that the COVID-19 crisis exploded in Lombardy, which is the most industrialized and the most polluted region of Italy and of all of Europe. So now let's get ready for the fight for the coming fight in the fall. First of all, to defend public health.
Sulla
So
santé
in
publique,
Italy, we put
sulla
forward
repressione della
the
gauche
idea
radicale.
of a political campaign
Però noi
for public health with
tagliamo
several
la
organizations of the radical left. And
anche
let's
per
prepare
la
the fight
réglementation de la réduction du temps de travail et de l'âge
against the economic crisis.
en
Let's
sachant que
demand the reduction of working time and the decrease of the age of
avec
pension.
des patrons qui nous a envoyés au massacre
Negotiation is not possible with the bosses who sent us to die during the health crisis.
en masse lorsque
They will
ces
not
gouvernements
hesitate
Alors,
to implement massive
bon
layoffs.
travail, bon combat,
So we have a fight ahead. So good luck and have a good fight.
Merci.
Sorry for my French. Thank you, everyone.
Merci, Eliana.
Thank you, Eliana.
Le capitalisme n'est pas seulement
You demonstrated how
vol
capitalism
du travail, ou
is not just about stealing
quelque chose de
labor
radicalement
force.
humaniste, de quelque chose
It's something which is extremely anti-humanist.
qui met le profit devant la vie et
It's a system which puts profits before life.
révéler ces contradictions.
And the COVID-19 crisis accelerated and revealed those contradictions.
C'est que la crise du Covid s'est présentée dans un
The COVID-19 crisis
il y avait déjà
happened at a moment where we already had social movements, important social movements, strong social movements and protests, such as what happened in France
de la contestation de la réforme des retraites,
with the protest against the pension reform,
réforme qui a réveillé ou qui a
which was a reform
pris
which
l'attention de la gauche radicale
showed and which awoke the radical left and which showed the level of tension
militante de la gauche
in
radicale,
France.
la militante de l'NPA.
So now we'll have the point of view of an activist from the NPA, Sophie, who will discuss about the pension reform and the movement against the pension reform. So Sophie, whenever you want, you can start.
Oui, pardon. C'est bon, on m'entend? Oui.
Oui.
Non, mais donc, ouais, du coup, comme
Can everyone hear me?
présenté,
Yes.
et comme ce que tu viens de dire, on a vu que le capitalisme, il a
So,
pardon, le confinement et le Covid et sa
as was
gestion
said,
ont intensifié les
the
attaques
lockdown,
contre les
COVID-19, and its management intensified the attacks of the bourgeoisie against the working class. But indeed, there were already struggles going on before the COVID-19 crisis, in particular in France with the pension reform.
dans un premier point, de ce que cette
So
réforme
first
elle
of all,
reporte.
I'll tell you about
Voilà.
this reform and what changes it was supposed to bring about. And then I'll discuss about the struggle that happened against this reform. So the reform project was drafted by someone called Mr. Delevoye. So we used to have, he wanted to replace a system of a funded public pension of redistribution, where everyone funds the pension system and then it's being redistributed. And now he wanted to replace it with a point-based system where everyone earns points according to the time that you work. And then at the end of your life, at the end of your career, you just count the number of points that you accumulated, and then your pension is being calculated on this basis. This reform meant to bring to an end specific acknowledgements of difficulties at work, of difficult jobs, and so on. In the private sector, the pension until now is being calculated on the last 25 years where you had the best wages. And in the public sector, it's being calculated in the last 6 months of your career, which are often the 6 months where you earn the most. So this is supposed to be brought to an end, and this would result in a decrease of pension of between 20 and 40% for basically everyone. This would impoverish people in general. This reform is based on a golden rule which would be the idea that the part of the pension in the GDP should be below 14% of GDP.
On sait qu'il y a de plus en plus de retraités. Aujourd'hui,
But we know that we have more and more
de gens qui ont
retired people.
65 ans, et dans 20 ans, il y en aura 28%. Et donc, du coup, on se doute
In 20 years from now, we will have 28% of people who will be aged 60 and plus. So the points on which the new system is supposed to be based will have to decrease. Their value will have to decrease, so that the share of the pensions in the GDP does not increase. So
ça veut dire que ce régime par points-là, il peut, les points
this point-based system
selon ce que décide le gouvernement.
The points of the point-based system, their value can decrease according to what the government decides, according to the situation. In addition to this, you have a shifting age, the introduction of a shifting age in the pension reform. So nowadays, the age for retiring is 62 years old. Now they want to increase this age by 2 years. So, and they would say, okay, you can retire before this shifting age of 64. But if you retire, for example, 1 year before being 64, then you'll earn 5% less on your pension. So you can imagine that if you don't have much money, then you will be forced to work more.
De manière générale, l'âge de départ à la retraite.
So it actually means retiring at a later age, at the age of 64.
Injuste et inégal, parce que
it's a reform also which was unjust and unequal.
Aujourd'hui, les périodes de maladie,
nowadays, in the funded public pension system, periods of illness, periods of pregnancy, and so on, they are counted for the calculation of the pension. But with the new system, such periods would not count for the calculation of the pension at the end of the career. So people who have fragmented careers will be fragilized in such a new system. So this polarizes again, this increases again the difficulties for already precarious workers. What's more, the pension reform, this pension reform would have a strong negative impact on women. Nowadays already, women earn 30% less than men when they are retired. So with this reform, as I said, you lose the pension accumulated, the rights accumulated during pregnancy and after giving birth.
Au troisième enfant dans un couple, chaque parent touchait 10% en plus de sur sa pension de retraite.
Also, until now, after the third child of a woman, each parent would get 10% more on their pension, and now it's going to be 5% for one parent only. And considering wage inequalities between men and women, it will mostly benefit to men. So it's mostly men who will choose to get the 5% increase in their pension.
Qui accroît la dépendance des femmes.
So it's a pension which, in general, increases dependency of women and the possibility, for example, to flee away from a violent husband.
Des pensions qui existaient, qui servaient à maintenir le niveau de vie d'un couple, par exemple, après le décès d'un des deux. Et ça bénéficiait.
What's more, you had the special pension rules which allowed until now women to get their pension increased in case of a partner being deceased.
Donc, bon, voilà, j'arrête là-dessus, mais.
And this would not exist anymore in the new system.
Même en cas de divorce. Voilà, c'est-à-dire que en cas de divorce, il n'y aura pas de. Bon, et il y a un dernier truc, et je vais finir là-dessus sur l'explication de la réforme.
In general, women would be negatively impacted by the reform.
Donc,
and finally, one last thing is that we would so a funded public pension system would be replaced with an unfunded pension system where each one contributes to their own individual funds.
Étaient régulièrement invités à prendre des groupes, à prendre part à des groupes de réflexion dans les ministères.
Actually, here you had conflicts of interest because representatives of insurance companies in France were invited to meetings in the ministries and so on, and defended the idea of switching to an unfunded pension system where people would have to pay funds to private insurance companies and so on in order to get a pension.
Enfin, il y a notamment un article là-dessus qui est assez explicite. Il dit que, je le cite, que le secteur de l'assurance est appelé à se mobiliser afin que l'économie française puisse ainsi bénéficier.
There's an article in the draft of the law. There's an article which explicitly says that insurance companies are called on to mobilize, so to say, so that everyone could get a good level of pensions and so on. So there's so this is an extremely neoliberal measure. Much of the pension system would be managed by the private sector. It would favor financial speculation by private insurance companies, and it would favor the necessity for workers to pay funds to complementary pension systems.
Là, dans ce cas-là, on se doute que les plus aisés, ils pourront se permettre.
So this is another step in the breaking down of the pension system by the various governments in the last few years. This would favor the most wealthy people. This would increase inequalities. And the idea that this new system would supposedly be universal is a false idea. It's even a lure. It does not take into account the fact that some jobs are particularly difficult and should be acknowledged as such. And this is not a measure of social justice. This new reform is not a measure of social justice. 1 month after the draft was made public, trade unions called for a first date of national mobilization against the reform. This was on the 5th of December. It was a strong start. This protest was called by unions and left-wing political parties. It was even this protest was encouraged even by the more reformist trade unions, by the ones which are the closest to the government. So even those trade unions called on to protest. So you have to know that in France, the biggest trade union is close to the government, but even this union called for the first date of protest on the 5th of December. So there was a general agreement within the left on the demands and on the demand of not to negotiate with the government on this reform. So this protest for the 5th of December was prepared for 1 month. It was a huge success. There was more than 1 million people walking out in the streets. So that's like one French person out of 60. This was huge. This was a protest which was so big that we had not seen this in years. And from this starting point, there was a longer movement that started.
Dès le départ mobilisés comme la RATP.
Some sectors mobilized heavily from the very beginning, such as the RATP, which is the network of public transportation in Paris, which entered into a general strike for many weeks, for several weeks, with complete stops on some lines and on some subway lines, for instance. But in general, all lines were impacted. Then you had the SNCF, the public railway company, which also entered into a general strike, and the main train lines were also closed down. So those sectors, they mobilized a lot because they benefit from special pension regimes, which would be completely annihilated by the reform. So special regimes acknowledging the difficulty of their work. Another sector which we often don't have in mind mobilized a lot, which was the culture sector, with workers from libraries, ballet dancers, singers, and so on.
Qui ont fait un spectacle public et qui ont dit culture pour tous, et enfin voilà.
So you had the striking image, for example, with workers from the Paris Opera who went on strike but made free public representations in the street and so on. And in the health sector, the public education and so on also mobilized.
Au début, il y avait des dates de manifestation qui étaient très rapprochées.
So at first, you had protests with very narrow
et il y avait encore aussi
spaces between dates. So you had maybe 2 demonstrations a week. Plus, you had to this every Saturday. You had to add the Gilets jaunes demonstration, the yellow vest demonstration.
Des manifestations parlées.
These were days of protest here and there. So this was criticized by activists, as it meant there was no, it did not encourage for a general strike, which would go on for several weeks without stopping. Trade unions did not call for a general strike. And the sectors which were the most mobilized were in the public sector, and there was a difficulty to spread the strike movement to a general strike everywhere in all sectors. It did not happen. Little space was given to self-organization of workers on their workplaces.
Qui avait eu des gilets jaunes et de la colère sociale, mais aussi sur le mouvement du climat.
We tried to make links between this mobilization and the mobilization of yellow vests, between this mobilization and climate movement, between this mobilization and the feminist movement, and so on. There were many links with the feminist movements, in fact, because the women would be the main losers in this reform. And in the youth, there was no particular mobilization of the youth. This leads to a question mark, to an interrogation. The youth will be the most impacted. I mean, the youth nowadays has the impression that they will never live such a good life as their parents and so on, because of climate change, but also because of reforms in the education in the last few years, with reforms that impede on the possibility of studying and on future working conditions and unemployment conditions and so on. Plus, when you're young, you often have to work precarious jobs. You live in. You live in unsafe places and so on. So Francesco asks to end in like 2 or 3 minutes.
Chez les jeunes, en parallèle, il y avait un mouvement
and in the youth,
sur la précarité parce que
There was a movement that started on against precariousness
avait fait une tentative de suicide devant
after a student tried
parce qu'il était précaire. Et donc, du coup, ça avait
to commit suicide publicly because he was living in a precarious situation. This led to a lot of anger from students on their living conditions. So we tried to show the links between our living conditions as students and our future living conditions with this pension reform. So now, and I'll come to an end soon, the government tried to have this law, the reform adopted by force. So the government adopted what is being called the Article 49.3, which allows the government to pass a law without the parliament voting on it.
Voilà.
So this was considered to be a denial of democracy. So this also sparked protests. And before this Article 49.3 was even passed, the pandemic of COVID-19 changed the whole situation.
Le scandale sanitaire qui a entouré la prise en charge de l'épidémie comme en France. Donc, pareil, le manque de moyens, le manque de lits.
With the lockdown and the health scandal, because we also lacked of medical supplies and space in hospitals and so on, the government said that he would suspend the application of the reform. But now in September, the government wants to come back with this reform in September to apply it. And it also used the pandemic and the lockdown to decrease, to attack again the working conditions of people, trying to increase the working time and to worsen the rights of the workers. So this crisis had an impact on everyone. All right, okay. So I will stop here.
Donc je pense que aussi la question des retraites nous aide à penser la nature.
All right. Thank you, Sophie. It looks like the pension reform helps us to think about the way that the state works. The state tries to pass reforms that are in favor of capital accumulation. The state favors the most powerful. And what Sophie said about social movements is also interesting because those social movements are the most important ways to react against those anti-social measures. And Carolina from Portugal will also discuss social movements. Carolina is the spokesperson for Precarios Inflexibles, so unflexible precarious workers. This is what it means. And she will speak about the importance of social movements. Sorry, my phone just fell down. All right, so Carolina, you can speak now.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so just to give a little bit of context first. So in Portugal, so I'm a member of Precários Inflexíveis Association, who was created in 2012 during the same year of que se lixa Troika public demonstrations, and which were the public demonstrations in response to 2008 economical crisis. So we've been active ever since. So, and that's why we actually, so we had a little bit of importance in the Portugal context. So, and that's why we were able to have a voice during the COVID-19 pandemics in terms of working conditions and to help workers here in Portugal. So here in Portugal, the emergency state started in the mid-March, and immediately there were a lot of workers that started to get fired, and a lot of people were confused about their situations, and they didn't properly knew their working rights, and there was a lot of confusion about that. Precários Inflexíveis, in association with the housing association called Res do Chão, we started this platform called Plataforma Resposta Solidária, where people would send emails and messages with their doubts about their working situations and housing situations. And the idea was to respond to their doubts and help people to know their rights and just trying to get their situations in a better state. During March and the beginning of April, this was like total chaos because we were receiving dozens and dozens of emails with a lot of type of doubts about working conditions, and it was really confusing. And so, because by that time the government was creating laws about layoff and about independent workers, every single day there was like this new thing, and people were getting confused about what they could or couldn't do about it. And then by middle of April, we started this petition called Ninguém Fica Sem Apoio, because the social security economical supports to people, they were really low, and the criteria that the government was creating to decide who had right to receive this economical support or not were really not enough, and they were leaving a lot of people out. This talking about like independent workers, of course. So we started this petition to force the government to create new criteria so that more people could get economical support by the social security system. Because, for example, people who had a contract at the same time they were doing independent work didn't have any rights of receiving any economical support. And there were also, for example, my case, I in Portugal, people who work as independent workers, we don't have to pay. So normally people in the first year of working as a freelancer, as independent workers, don't have to pay social securities taxes. So all of these people in these situations didn't have right to receive any social security support, and there was people with nothing at all during 3 months. It was completely chaos, and so we were basically, our work was to, by April we were like releasing, we were sending press releases like every week, because it was really getting confusing, because the government had these criteria, and each week they were changing it, and so people were getting really confused, and it was total chaos. by using the information that people were giving to us, we called out to social media. We did a lot of pressure towards the government, to saying that they needed to change this criteria, and we got we were successful in some ways, and well, yeah, and that was it basically. So in here, well, here the situation, as you know, like in international social media, here in Portugal, we by April, May, we were getting cheerings because we were having a good response to the pandemic situation, which was kind of frustrating because people who were saying that we had a good response to that were only looking to the infected people numbers and not looking to what actually was happening inside the country. Because it doesn't matter if we had 100, 210, or 0 cases of COVID-19 cases, while people here actually were starving. And we had a lot of people that weren't in homeless situations before of the pandemics, and they started to have a lot of difficulties. Some were kicked out of their houses, and it was really difficult because the government wasn't able to respond to this situation. And yeah, and basically, yeah, we had to, it was positive in a certain way because actually it was a situation where we could actually see social movement changing, the government thinking, and in that way it was really positive. But we are in this situation for almost 5 months, and there's still people who don't have any kind of economical support, and it's been stressful.
Ok, donc merci Carolina. Maintenant, on a terminé le cycle d'exposé. Donc, si les camarades qui sont ici veulent poser des questions, ils sont libres et encouragés à le faire. Donc, si vous voulez, vous pouvez poser des questions. S'il n'y a pas personne, je voudrais commencer avec des questions. Ok, il y a des problèmes avec la... Ok, il y a des problèmes avec la traduction en anglais.
Nathan, can you hear me? We need the English translation.
Ok, je ne sais pas si c'est prêt. Ok, on attend. Pendant ce temps, pensez à des questions qui Eliana, Sophie et Carolina seront heureuses de vous répondre. Donc, quand c'est prêt, vous envoyez un message. When the translation is ready, do you send a message? Okay.
Sorry. Hello.
If it's ready,
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Good. We made it. Donc, je passe au français. Et la première question que je voudrais
So,
poser
for the first question that I would like to ask to Sophie, Carolina, and Eliana, you can answer in the same order as we followed during the introductions. Is so you talked about social movements and the response of the working class to the authoritarian measures sometimes taken by the government in the field, for example, of the pension system in France, but more generally in the responses to the epidemic. I would like to ask about the role of the trade unions, including the reformist trade unions, but also the more radical unions. So what was their role in the dialogue with the government and in the organization of protests? So what was the role of the trade unions in your own countries? So I think Eliana could start. I think she wanted to speak Italian. I don't know if someone can interpret Eliana into English or whether I do it into French. So the English interpreter cannot do Italian to English.
Ok, Marta va traduire de l'italien à l'anglais.
All right, so we'll have Marta doing Italian to English.
Okay, so on attend la.
So we'll wait for Marta being registered as an interpreter by the host.
Eliana a des problèmes avec le microphone.
It seems like Eliana has trouble with her mic.
Ok. Si Eliana peut essayer en français, c'est bon.
So if Eliana could try in speaking French, that would be great. Can you try?
Ok, bon.
All right.
Tu peux allumer le microphone? Tu n'arrives pas à le faire?
So Eliana, can you turn on your mic?
Si tu n'arrives pas à utiliser le microphone, on peut faire.
Ok.
Bon.
Ça va.
Okay.
Je vais essayer à parler français.
So I will try
mais
to speak in
s'il vous plaît,
French.
pardonnez-moi parce que
But
ce n'est pas facile pour moi.
Please excuse my French. It's
Quel
not
était
easy
le
for me.
rôle du syndicat? Alors, comme je dis,
So what was the role of the trade unions?
les syndicats
Well, as I said,
ont compris trop tard
trade unions understood too late
qu'est-ce qu'il
what
était passé
was
à
happening
in
in March
pendant la crise sanitaire.
during the health crisis.
Les syndicats ont compris trop tard.
Trade unions understood too late.
D'un côté, parce que peut-être à Rome, les syndicales de la bureaucratie n'ont pas compris qu'est-ce qu'il était passé dans les régions du Nord.
On the side of the leadership,
okay?
so
Parce que il y avait une situation très différente parmi les régions italiennes. Ce qu'il est passé au nord de l'Italie, c'est pas la même chose. Qu'est-ce qu'il est passé dans le reste du pays?
What happened in the north
Et
of
en
Italy is not the same
qu'il
thing as what
est
happened in
passé
the
chez
rest of
moi
the country.
à Lombardie, à Bergamo, comme
And
vous
what
j'ai
happened in my
déjà
city in particular, in
raconté.
Bergamo,
Mais il y a
even different
un
than what happened in the
problème
rest of Lombardy, as I
plus central,
explained earlier.
plus important, pas seulement de n'avoir pas compris.
But there is
Qu'est-ce qu'il passe?
there is a more important problem, which is that the trade unions not
Je
only
peux
did
continuer?
not understand.
Oui, ok.
Did not
Pas seulement
understand
de n'avoir
fast
pas
enough,
compris tout de suite, avoir compris trop tard, mais avoir
but
choisi
also
de
that the
soutenir
trade unions
les
decided to
gouvernements
support
dans leur
the
politique.
government.
Les syndicats principaux, les syndicats
The main trade unions, the
même
reformist
moi,
trade unions,
syndicat,
decided to support the government
grand syndicat italien,
and the policies that it was
CGIL,
implementing.
a décidé de soutenir le gouvernement.
So my trade union
Mais d'autre côté,
decided to
il y
support the
avait
government, for instance. But on the other hand,
l'association de patronat, des patronnes, en France c'est la MEDEF, en Italie il s'appelle Confindustria,
the organization of the bosses,
qui a joué un rôle
Confindustria,
vraiment féroce, vicieux,
so the organization
je pense
representing the
on peut
interests
dire,
of the employers,
nous
played an
envoyer au
extremely
massacre,
vicious
comme
role,
j'ai déjà raconté. Et alors,
sending
nous
us to
avons
die,
eu une
as I explained earlier.
les patrons très à
So the
l'attaque.
bosses
Et les
were very much
syndicats
on the offensive,
totalement passifs
and the trade unions
à soutenir le gouvernement,
were completely
ça va,
passive,
mais
supporting the
je
government,
pense que le syndicat devait être à
while
l'attaque aussi pour défendre la santé et la vie de travailleurs et de
should have
travailleuses. Parce que
defended
je
the
vais vous dire une
life of
chose,
workers.
nous avons
Let me tell you
toujours
one thing.
je savais toujours, après le Covid, que les profits viennent après vaut plus que notre vie pour les patrons, ok? Mais il y avait à marre
Of course,
durant
for
la
the bosses,
crise
profits
sanitaire,
come
une
first.
situation où
But during the health crisis,
l'action de patron a eu des conséquences, pas seulement sur notre salaire, pas seulement sur
the
notre
action of the
droit,
bosses had
ok, sur
consequences
l'horaire
not only on our wages, not only on our working rights,
les contrats, les salaires, la précarité. Non, sur notre vie.
but
Et alors,
directly
j'aurais
on our
voulu un
lives.
syndicat capable de défendre la vie des travailleurs et des travailleuses avant tout. Et c'est pas possible ce qu'il a passé pour
a
une
union should have
raison très
defended first
simple.
and foremost
Nous ne
the lives
savons
of the
pas
workers, and this
si
did
en
not happen.
automne on aura
We don't
une
know
autre
what will happen
crise
in the fall.
sanitaire due au Covid.
We don't know if
Alors
we
je
will have
pense que ce n'est pas
another
plus
health
possible
crisis
que
due
le
to
syndicat
the COVID-19.
comprendre 4 semaines
But I think it's not possible that
dopo,
the trade unions
après, ok,
once again
avec 4 semaines de
understand
retard,
4 weeks later
que la vie de travailleurs et travailleuses et la vie de ceux qui vivent dans
it's
un
not possible
territoire,
trade
c'est
unions
plus
wait so
important
long
des
to
profits.
understand that
Et que
the
s'il
lives
y
of
a
workers
une urgence
are more
sanitaire,
important than
les
profits.
usines,
And
les
if there's a health
entreprises
crisis, the companies and the
doivent
factories
être fermées
should be
parce
closed
que
down
les profits ne peuvent pas
because profits cannot come before,
être plus importants de nos vies.
cannot be more important than our lives.
Mais bien, même si les syndicats, on a eu tout ce retard et on a décidé de soutenir le gouvernement et pas de combattre, mais il y a eu un moment à main où nous avons fermé, arrêté les usines, même avec les grèves, seulement avec les délégués. Alors, on n'a pas besoin d'attendre les centrales syndicales bureaucratiques. Voilà.
But what we
Pardonnez-moi
demonstrated
pour mon
during the
français,
crisis is that
s'il
we
vous plaît.
didn't need the bureaucratic leaderships of trade unions to close down the factories. The strikes, the wave of strikes managed to do that in some places. So we don't have to wait on the bureaucratic leaderships of trade unions. All right, now, Sophie, if you can speak for 2 to 3 minutes, that would be great. So that maybe then we can leave the floor for discussion and questions by comrades who are here on the Zoom discussion. Sophie, can you hear me? If Sophie is not around, then Carolina could speak first. All right, so we may have some technical problems. Can people hear me?
Okay.
Okay. I don't know why Sophie and Carolina cannot hear me. So until this technical difficulty is solved, oh, it seems like Carolina is around. So Carolina, if you want to answer, let's go. You have 2 to 3 minutes. Carolina, can you hear me?
Jonathan, you should unlock the microphones, please.
We know. We're on the
Okay.
way.
Okay. So here in Portugal, the situation was a little bit different because when emergency state was declared, most people and most companies stopped working. We didn't have that issue. Unless we had this issue with the call centers. So call centers were still working while people were already at home for 15 days, and they were really fighting for working as working at home. And this was kind of a struggle we have here. But so the call centers union is not one of the official unions. It's one of those new unions, that were created recently. But here the unions had they didn't have quite a quick response, but basically they were going with the government flow, as in because it was really confusing to have opinions and forming to say we want this when the government was constantly changing their minds. But yeah, here official unions didn't have that much of impact they should have had. But yeah, I think that this was a really good example of what social movement can bring, and we don't have to wait for official unions to respond to all questions, because it's like Eliana said, they get too bureaucratic and they act too slow. And so, yeah, it was really important that we had people working as social movement and not just waiting for the official union's response to crisis.
Bon, merci beaucoup. C'est l'occasion de...
All right. Thank you very much. Now, Sophie has the opportunity to speak. Sophie, if someone can turn on her mic. Well, it seems like Sophie is not available. I can't see any questions from comrades here in the chat box or asking to take the floor.
Okay. Ina.
Okay, Ina
Denmark.
from Denmark. You can speak now.
Hi, comrades. Okay, I would like to ask a question about the organization of precarious workers that you have had some experience with in Portugal. In Denmark, we have some of the comrades from SUF has tried to organize precarious workers, especially young precarious workers. But we have found it a bit difficult, both because precarious workers usually aren't organized in their trade unions, but also because many of them are quite short-term employed. So what's your experience in Portugal and also in France and Italy? If you have any similar organizations, how did you manage to get people organized there?
Ok, donc Eliana peut répondre. 3
All right,
minutes.
so Eliana, maybe you want to answer. Can speak for 3 minutes, and then 3 minutes for Carolina. And of course, Sophie can also have 3 minutes if she's around. But I'm not sure she is. So Eliana, if you want, you can start answering.
Ok. Tu peux parler.
Oui, mais pardon, je n'ai pas compris la demande.
Yes, but sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question.
Ok, si la camarade puisse répéter la question.
Sorry, so if the comrade can repeat the question, because Eliana did not hear the question.
Yes, I'm wondering how you managed to organize people in the different organizations of precarious workers.
Oui, bien. Alors, je vais essayer en français. Alors, nous avons...
All right, so let me try in French. So we have the same difficulties. Oh, wait.
Okay.
All right. So we have similar difficulties. But we had many experiences in this period of COVID-19 because the health crisis led to explosions, social explosions. In sectors where precariousness was always high, and those precariousness levels exploded with the COVID-19 crisis. In the sectors of arts, culture, and shows, in particular, there were important mobilizations by young, precarious arts workers in this period. It was as if the health crisis was the spark that triggered an explosion, which may have results, including in organizing those workers, maybe in developing new unions for these workers. I'm not sure. I don't know what will happen, because of course we have similar difficulties organizing precarious workers due to
oui, des contraintes. Mais je pense que
due to the difficulties of their specific situation. But it seems like the situation we just lived through could be a historic opportunity. And I think we should try to help those young precarious workers to organize, to collectively organize. But of course, we'll have to face similar difficulties all over Europe, linked with the conditions, the specific conditions of precarious workers, as well as they are linked to the difficulties for bureaucratic trade unions to understand these precarious conditions. All right, Carolina, if you want to speak, you can speak now.
3 minutes.
For 3 minutes.
Il a le même problème de microphone.
Now we may have the same microphone problem.
Hello. Here in Portugal, like I said in the beginning, we were lucky because we have been organized since the 2008 crisis, and so that's why here we had a quick response to that, because we have been for more than a decade working on this area. But here actually we are not so young people are not that organized, because in the young generation we have this problem with false self-employment, which, you know, when you work as an independent worker, when you in fact should have a contract, a working contract. But yeah, so young people right now, we don't work in specific areas like I've been a nurse for all my life, so I'm in the nurse unions, you know. So people get too dispersed. They don't organize themselves that easy. But I think with this crisis we were able to unite people a little bit more, because there was a lot of people feeling the same issues in concerns of working conditions. So we worked with those things, and so like we did what the government was supposed to do, like grabbing people's worries and problems, and saying like, you should do this because you're not looking to people, and people need this. But this is well, it was not easy to make people unite themselves, because yeah, people don't have particularly working areas, so it's a little bit difficult to organize young people in unions or associations. But yeah, so we also, here in Portugal, we also actually had like the culture people, you know, dancers, etc., etc. the culture union was always like a really confused area where people were really confusing organizing themselves. But actually during this pandemics crisis, they actually organized themselves and did a lot of government pressure also to the culture minister. And yeah, but I don't know what I can actually like it. I don't have any tips to give you to help you organize there in Denmark, but yeah, I think yeah.
Bon.
All right.
S'il n'y a pas encore Sophie,
If Sophie is not around, I could maybe conclude.
Je voudrais remercier beaucoup Eliana, Carolina,
I would like to thank very much Eliana, Carolina, and Sophie. I would also like to conclude by saying that you should not forget to take part to the next roundtable, which will take place in 1 hour at 5:30, which will be called Let's Fight Against Capitalist Normativity, Political Strategy and Organizations Today. The speakers will be Luis Rangel from Mexico, Laia Facet from the Spanish state, and Leonard Brice from France. So I encourage you to continue taking part to this cycle of educationals and roundtables by the Fourth International, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you, everyone.